Do you ever think about what happened before the Instagram photos? Or before your favorite potter hit 25,000, 50,000 followers? Off and on, many people will talk about the real life versus Instagram life, and there's plenty of hilarious memes floating around the entire internet about them. But I'd wager a bet that while any of us, myself included, are scrolling through Instagram, we are never actively reminding ourselves of what that maker's life looked like before that photo. The years of saving money, the months of trial and error, the delays because of things outside of our control or in our control, the sacrifices made because we want this crazy dream to make a living from the things we make so freaking badly. Well, that's exactly what Sophia McEvoy and I sat down to talk about, and what this, episode 116 of The Maker's Playbook, the show where we talk about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make, is all about. I'm your host, Rebecca Ikes-Kara. Hey, Sophia, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for having me.
I kind of strong-armed you into doing this.
You did. It was a wrangle, but you got me here, and I'm very glad to be here.
Absolutely. Well, for people who don't know you, who's Sophia? How did you come to be on this crazy podcast?
So I'm Sophia McEvoy. I work from my garden studio in Suffolk, and I've been potting since, I'd suppose, 2012 when I left university. I initially was doing it on the weekends around a full-time job. I was a teaching assistant and then a teacher. And in 2017, I left that and threw myself into pottery full-time. And that's where I am now in my parents' back garden, in my garden studio, working away every day.
I don't know a single UK potter who doesn't have this quintessential garden shed. Like I don't even want to call it a shed because they're the most beautiful, like, wall of windows. And is there a company that specializes in making these for everybody?
Yes, it's the quintessential English garden cabin company place. Yeah, we all go to the same place.
We should get the URL to reserve that website. And start promoting
we'd make a killing, wouldn't we?
Oh, shoot. So you've been full-time for 4 years now. It's 2021.
Oh my gosh, it's 20. Yeah, I keep saying 3 years. I'll say 3 years until it's 10 years and then realise I have to update. But yeah, I'd say full-time with the caveat that I didn't start posting on Instagram till last July 2020. Mm-hmm. So when I say full-time every day in the studio, practicing and honing and refining, but actually in the job.
Yeah.
Just under a year. But yes, full-time since 2017.
It's interesting to think about for me, like the space between leaving full-time teaching in 2017 and then it sounds to me like you really took ownership of, okay, this is my job and career now a year ago. What were those first 2 years kind of like?
I think the first 2 years, so for context, when I finished teaching in July 2017 and I moved down to my parents in Suffolk, and they were making a move at the same time. So my dad got a new job, he moved, and they said, you can carry on teaching, you've got all these savings, you can get a mortgage, get on the property ladder, continue doing the pottery around your job at the weekends. But I think I was really fortunate that they could see I was struggling with that reality, and they said, move with us, we'll get a place with a garden, you can set up, you can go full time. So in 2017, July, I left teaching. We moved down to Suffolk, and for 6 months we were renting. So I couldn't set up a studio until the start of 2018. And then it took 6 months to build the studio, get the plumbing, get the electrics. So fast forward a year was when I actually really started working. And then those kind of 2 years up until my first post in July 2020 were glaze testing. I taught myself to throw in that time because I had a wheel, but I really hadn't practiced. I was a bit scared of getting on the wheel and it all going wrong. And it gave me just 2 years of solid practice. And in that time, my taste changed and I got really tight on what I wanted my work to look like. And I knew that I wanted to come in at a certain level and present my work at a certain point. And it took time, but I held off for quite a long time on putting it out there in front of everyone.
Which is hard.
It was actually for me. For a lot of it, I was completely dictated by nerves and a lack of confidence. And so actually it was really easy not to post anything on Instagram. I did avoid it for quite some time, and perhaps I could have gone in a little bit sooner and posted a little bit sooner. But I would say there was a gut feeling about knowing that it wasn't the right time. And I had plenty of people around me going, come on, when are you going to post? When are you going to sell your first thing? When are you going to open a website? And I just knew, gut instincts, that my work wasn't ready, that I wasn't ready to put it out there. And so it took those 2 years to really become confident enough. I think in one of your first podcasts, Camille said, can I in good conscience sell this mug?
Yeah.
And it took me 2 years to be able to say, yes, I can now.
Oh, that's so important. That's so important, because actually there was a client, a bride of mine, who was the first person to ever buy my pottery work, and she wanted a set of bowls. I mean, she didn't buy a vase, right? She was like, hey, can you make me new cereal bowls? And so here I was thinking, oh, totally, I'll make 8 matching bowls.
Yeah.
4 months into having started pottery? Like, what? And she has them. And anytime I think of this, I'm so embarrassed by the idea of what the experience of using those bowls every day must be like, that I think I'll probably send her a message after we get off this and be like, can I do those again for you?
I do think there's something to be said, though, in looking back at the start and your work at the start, and rather than being embarrassed by it, just appreciating how far you've come. And I'm actually just looking at a really early planter. Hang on, I'll show you, obviously.
Yeah,
but this is like an early slab-built planter that I built in my garage up in the Northeast in 2012, 2013.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's awful. It is truly bad. But equally, I look at it with pure love, because it was my beginning piece, and she'll see it from a completely different standpoint, won't she, as a non-potter?
Yeah, I guess I just think of, I remember I made her those bowls on this red clay that we have at our community studio that's groggy, that I loved the effects that it got with this cream glaze over it, but it also meant that I have some here. And now when I put a spoon in, it's like the sound, or any potter listening is going to know exactly what I'm talking. Yeah. There's this scraping sound that I'm like, oh gosh, what a terrible idea from like a
the grit coming up with your cereal. Yeah.
Yes. Like that shouldn't have been sold to anybody, I think. And so for you having the wherewithal to say, hold on a second, I'm not going to dive down too quickly to try and also making the sacrifice to say, okay, I'm going to move. I'm not going to try and have my own space, because then that would have demanded you, I imagine, to sell a lot faster in order to just pay the mortgage.
Looking back, it's funny. It was a choice, not a decision, which doesn't make sense. But when I think about the moment where I thought, oh, I want to be a full-time potter, I can't even remember that moment. It was always just, I was born that way, and it was always just going to happen. But it was certainly a choice, like you said, to sacrifice a wage and sacrifice my own living space. And I say sacrifice in the loosest sense of the word, because it's lovely living here and my parents are so supportive. But I could have struggled on the weekends for a lot longer. And so that was a very calculated choice to say, okay, I'll sacrifice a wage and a social life and nice things and a holiday and a car, because there was some serious tunnel vision going on about what I wanted to do and what I wanted to achieve with it. And so that kind of extended into the decision-making process between starting and when I was ready to release my work. I'd taken so much time to get to that point already that I wanted it to be just right.
Yeah. And as someone a few years, not in pottery, but in just business ownership, a few years down the road, maybe without you knowing it, what's so smart about that also is that you have now entered the space at a different place. I'm talking with my hands now and nobody can see us. We're on Zoom for people who don't understand when we're saying, hey, let me show you. But you've entered in at a higher, I mean, just even what first connected us on Instagram was when I looked at your photos and went, hold on a second, here's a potter who knows a little bit more about what they're doing than most. Like, just taking the time to learn how to photograph your stuff properly and have a style to that as well puts you at a place where you can demand a little higher rate for your pieces rather than trying to start the business from the beginning where you're still learning and changing. The point I'm trying to get to is what I experienced with my photography was, as my skills improved and I knew I needed to change my prices, it was actually exponentially harder to do that because I had a network. I had built up referrals and people who wanted to work with me who were expecting one price point, and I was going, actually, I'm here now. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And I think that's important. I'd be hesitant to say that it was all super calculated and that I was very intentional. Part of it was just fear and a bit of perfectionism that stopped me. And perhaps if I'd started earlier, maybe I'd be further ahead. But I like to think that by taking that time, I just became more confident and more sure in my work, and that I was able to put it across in the way that I'd envisioned. Because although I hadn't posted on Instagram till last year, I've had Instagram since 2012. So I've been watching for quite some time. I've been watching other potters, other creatives. I've been watching how they present their work, how they photograph their work. And so I had a really clear vision of the type of branding and the type of photography I wanted to achieve. And that just simply took time. So I try not to look on that time as wasted, rather as just slowly, steady research. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, and there's something to be said for the slow and consistent. I had a dear friend and mentor of mine the other day just say, it doesn't matter the time. If you're still chipping away each day, you're putting in the work each day to move forward, then the needle will move forward. So
maintaining the momentum rather than trying to speed up all the time and get somewhere really quickly.
Right, which has been, for me, the one strange blessing of all things COVID and lockdown, and oh my gosh, I can't wait until this isn't part of the conversation anymore.
Yeah, I know, the big C.
Right? But it's strangely been really nice to finally appreciate the slowdown rather than constantly feel like I have to hustle and keep up and I'm behind and oh my gosh. For the first time, I think in 10 years, I feel like I'm not actually, oh my gosh, I'm behind. I want to do all these things. I should have done them last month. Why? Nobody's telling me I'm behind. That's all in my head.
I know. I think sometimes we try and make ourselves busy because it's a form of control, isn't it? But I know that luckily for me, not a lot changed in terms of COVID. I was still able to come to work every day. So I'm so grateful that I've got this space and it is my refuge. So I can come away from the house. And because of COVID, there's 6 of us and we were all back in the same house for nearly a year together. And when we were talking about the living situation and making the choice to work from my parents' garden rather than get on the property ladder and do it on the weekends, I try and look at it now as just something to be grateful for because it won't be forever. And I know that I'll be struggling with a mortgage in years to come, going, oh, I wish I was back in my little garden studio. So, yeah, I'm trying to be grateful for the time now. It's definitely all of the difficulty that's come with it. It's definitely time you won't get again, I don't think, hopefully.
Yeah. Simon said recently he very specifically made a choice to live in places that weren't in the U.S., to live in kind of the cheap areas of the U.S. to make sure that he could focus on his style and making what he wanted to make and then selling secondly. And you look at how known his style is, how specific his style is, because that was the commitment. And I definitely know that it impacted my business and approach to have a storefront in Chicago and to have this overhead and to have staff and all of this kind of stuff, that it was great in many ways, but also in other ways it then demanded you had to meet a certain amount of revenue all the time. Yeah. And if you didn't, that was going to be a big problem. And so you were always focused on that rather than I'm going to take 6 months to think. Yeah. And that's it. And explore and experiment. Like you didn't have that luxury. So
no, and so that's why I feel I'm massively fortunate that I've been given that opportunity to do this unobstructed without those kind of overheads. And I don't actually think, sometimes I think that taking the time out and teaching and getting to where I am now, I've slowed myself down. But in fact, I think I've probably, in the grand scheme of things, parallel universes, I've caught up because I've had 2 years of unobstructed time to really power through with this and do things that I just wouldn't have been able to do on the weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. What was it like then? Once you got that post out on Instagram now, you're producing these gorgeous images. You've started. It's official. The world knows. You're selling and restocking and photographing and doing all of the things that...
It is brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. So it's brilliant to finally have the work out there and not be watching from the sidelines, watching other people do it. It's lovely to be doing it and to have the feedback that I've had, and just to have, return customers come back and invest in your pieces. So there's quite a lot of me that's still, seriously, really? You want more? So that's lovely. And then terrifying, because I remember hilariously last July hovering over the publish button on that first post and feeling sick. And confidence-wise, come a long way since then, but still putting yourself out there regularly is taking some getting used to. And definitely still racked with comparisons sometimes as a new starter, watching other people do their thing and thinking, am I even good enough to be in this space? I'm still really new to this. And sometimes you do feel like you're not quite at that standard yet, and you can beat yourself up a bit. And particularly working in isolation alone, you are your worst critic, and there is nobody there to say, no, come on, you're doing fine. It's just you. So it's like a constant back and forth, talking to yourself, giving yourself pep talks. So in that respect, it can be a bit tough, but the last 6 months have been amazing. Just, realise the dream, and it's brilliant.
I wish I could put words to the way that your smile just changed when you actually thought about the last 6 months.
Yeah, it's been good.
It really is actually happening, and you are actually doing it, and it's working.
Yeah. I mean, I used to have moments when we first moved down here where I would be on a dog walk and there'd be stuff in the studio drying, and I'd be coming home to put the wood burner on and make a cup of tea and throw some pots. And I used to be on a dog walk, for example, and I'd look at the clock and I'd be like, oh, it's 10:10. I'd be teaching year 9 right now. Or, I'd be on break duty out in the yard. And now I get to say, I don't have to do that anymore. I'm not doing that anymore. So having those realizations, even now, 3 years on, 4 years on, really, that definitely makes me smile.
And what was the impetus for, this is probably an obvious question, because anybody working a job who's wishing that they could be full-time pottery is going, what do you need to ask that for, Rebecca? Like, of course, we all wish we were doing pottery full-time. But of the teachers I know, teaching isn't exactly like the office job sitting there because you just fell into it. Or maybe you did fall into it. But
it's definitely a vocation, isn't it?
Yeah, in some ways.
I think I did fall into it, but I fell into it with love. I loved the job and I loved the kids. They were brilliant. But it was by accident. So when I left university, I went back to my old school, and they have a ceramics department. That was where I first got the bug for ceramics.
Okay.
And I went back to use their facilities. My old ceramics teacher said, why don't you come back, use the classroom when I haven't got lessons in. When I have, you can hide in the kiln cage. So I did that. I did one show in Liverpool. It was like a day Christmas show. It gave me enough of a spark to say, people want your stuff. You can sell your stuff. Mm-hmm. So I was determined I wanted it to be my career. But then while I was there and I was working, a job advert came up for a learning support assistant, and he said, why don't you apply for that? And I knew coming out of university, the university course, I mean, that's a whole different story, but there was no throwing taught, no making glazes, no firing kilns, no business information, no teaching on how to run a business. So I came out wholly unprepared for the career that I wanted. And
were you studying ceramics at university also?
So at university, yes, I did 3D design, and the course wasn't quite what I'd imagined it to be. It wasn't what I wanted it to be. It was much more based around the concept, and that was the driving force behind the projects. There wasn't a lot of hands-on teaching, and I mean physical hands-on teaching, right. So throwing and making.
Increasing your skills as a craft.
Yes, exactly. And I didn't have that. So I left feeling quite unprepared. And so I thought, I can't start a career as a maker straight away. That's impossible, surely not. So the job advert came up. I got the job as a learning support assistant. I did that for 2.5 years. And then my old ceramics teacher then said, I think you'd be really good at teaching. Why don't you apply as a teacher? And I was like, right, okay. And so I applied to be a teacher, and it was a lovely full circle moment because he was my ceramics teacher and then he became my teaching mentor. And so he mentored me through a training year of teaching, and then obviously became my colleague for the year, my first year of full-time teaching. And then a lovely full circle moment again, teaching back in the classroom, teaching students where I'd first learned ceramics. And I was teaching what I'd been taught. It was lovely. But so in that respect, I did just fall into each stage of it. But I knew the entire time that it was temporary. I knew the entire time that I wouldn't do this forever. And I loved it, but I loved ceramics more. Mm-hmm. And I think if I didn't have the ceramics, teaching would have been my vocation. It wasn't a stopgap. Oh, I might as well just do the job for a while, because it's not something that you can just do and switch off from. It's not a passive job. You've really got to, it's a performance, and you've got to pour yourself into it, and you've got to really love what you're doing. But it wasn't forever. So, yeah.
That's amazing. That's also really important that you knew while you were doing it that it was temporary. It's a completely different mindset to be in, knowing it's temporary, rather than when you're in a job wondering, will I ever be able to change? Will I ever be able to get out? I think it's I don't know, maybe it gives us more energy, or it helps you through somehow.
I think it was definitely a driver for, the only way I can term it is like aggressive saving. So making sure that I saved enough money. So I got to build my studio in my parents' garden, and that would have been a house deposit, for example. But that kind of aggressive saving over 5 years was because I knew that the teaching wasn't permanent. It wasn't forever. I just didn't realise that it would be as brief as it was, because there were elements of the job that I absolutely loved and I still miss.
Sure.
But yeah, it was a foregone conclusion. I didn't make that decision. I just knew it was always going to be the ceramics.
It was in your bones. That's amazing.
Yes.
So ceramics originally was like elementary, high school, secondary school was when you were first introduced to it.
Yes.
And I'm saying this because I'm epically jealous. I took one art class in high school, period.
Well, we're so lucky. The English school system is years 7 to 11, which is when you are 11 years old to 16 years old. And then you can go on to do an apprenticeship, or you can go on, get a job, or you can go on to further education, which we call sixth form, where you're 16 to 18. And I left my school down in the southeast of England, age 16. We moved up to the northeast of England, and I went to a completely separate sixth form, which is where I ended up working. And that's where the art department was, and a huge art department. And it had a photography department and a textiles department and a ceramics department. So massively lucky that I got that experience early on. And it makes me wonder whether I would have ended up in ceramics had I not had that land in my lap, so to speak.
I have to take a complete tangent and ask you where in the Northeast you were, because you for sure weren't that far north based upon your accent, because I spent a year in Newcastle and you are so far from being a Geordie, it's not even funny.
Well, I was born in the southeast of England, in Kent, so that's my accent, but I worked in Hartlepool, which is probably about a 50-minute drive from Newcastle south. Yeah.
Just every time you said the Northeast, I was like, you are nowhere near what I think east.
We were there for 11 years, but definitely didn't pick up the accent. I would have loved to. I loved the accent.
Nobody ever says they love the Geordie accent.
Just the Northeast accent in general. It's lovely. It's so endearing. Of all the places to end up in England.
I know. Well, it was interesting because that's actually where I first learned ceramics. As a kid, there were some like summer programs or things where I think we got to play with modeling clay or stuff you got to put in the oven at home and air dry or whatever. But what you would call a gap year after university, I did a year of full-time volunteer work at an arts program in Newcastle with at-risk 8 to 12-year-olds. And it just so happened, like, I got super in. There was a ceramics room. There was a woman who ran it that was starting to teach me things, like showed me how to center maybe once, and then found out she was pregnant and was like, so I'm leaving. Do you want to run the room? She goes, just don't change any settings on the kiln. You push this one and this one. So I basically learned how to load and start a kiln as long as all the settings were correct.
Oh, that is a baptism of fire.
Oh my gosh. And every time I was teaching the kids, and of course it was a very tiny room, and so we only had maybe 4 kids at a time for that particular activity. And there were 2 wheels, and anytime they wanted me to just finish a project for them, they just were like, oh, I can't do it. You just do it. And I was rubbish at centering. Like, I wasn't any better than the 8-year-olds. And I was like, no, you have to. It's important to see your work through. It's important
learn through doing.
It's important to finish what you started.
It's a great teacher tactic. I can tell you that.
Simply because I couldn't center any better than they could. So anyways, that's my Newcastle story. But that's what started it all. And it was interesting to actually see the example of working artists. That was the first time I saw, to my memory. I am sure there are other people and family friends who might listen to this and be like, what the heck, Rebecca? I did this or I did that. But seeing people who had families and mortgages and all of these other things who were making a living being a woodworker or a ceramicist or a sculpture or music or all these other art forms and going, oh, you can, there's something, they weren't doing it in their spare time. They weren't volunteering their time. This was their job.
I think that was part of the problem with the university course and being at that age and getting into it as a whole, is that you're not massively exposed to that side of things. It's very much painted as a hobby or as something you can do as a side hustle, but not as a full-time gig. And it took Instagram really, and watching other people make it a reality on Instagram for me to go, oh, this is a career that I could do. And watching people who are quite honest about how much money they make from it and the fact that they do make money and they can pay a mortgage, that was huge for me to see other people doing it, because it meant that when I had family members question, really, is this viable? Maybe you could go back to teaching. I could say, no, this person's doing it and they're making this much, so I can do it too. And for all of the pitfalls of Instagram and the comparison trap you can get caught in, watching other people do it and do it well and make a living from it has been huge. It's just opened a door. Yeah.
Where did you do any research as far as setting up the business and do it? I mean, because you've got it, from my perspective of seeing you online, you are now the person who's showing people, not from a teaching standpoint yet, but like you're now doing it, right? Like it's...
Yeah,
so, I mean, is there places that you found inspiration as far as, okay, here's how I set up the business, or here's how you mentioned before we hit record that you don't exactly have a schedule down yet for restocks. And yeah, I see you post these pictures of your like 3-month planning and I'm going, I think you do have that part done.
I don't have a 3-month plan, definitely. I plan ahead knowing roughly when I want the shop to be and what I want to be in there. And I base that off the last shop and what was popular and what I think is going to be popular. But it is definitely still very much playing it by ear. And I don't have a kind of a year-long plan of where I want to be. And I know I should probably start making a big, long plan. But at the moment, I feel, especially in the beginning, finding my feet and getting to know my customers, it feels more natural to be quite reactive. And part of it is I have that luxury to be able to do that because I've got the studio here and I've got the equipment and the last shop has paid for the materials to be able to make the next batch. So going from shop update to shop update works for me at the moment. And then once I've got my confidence with, I know sales best, what I like, what works for me and what works for my business, then I think I'd be in a much better position to forward plan. But I'm not a massive kind of forward planner, and I'm doing the hand movement. Yeah, right. You know what I mean? I don't stick to a massive rigid plan. And in terms of business and knowing how to run a business, very much knowledge-wise in my infancy with that. I am learning day to day, and at the moment it's very much just following marketing accounts and people who run their own businesses and feeding off what they're doing and taking cues from that and hoping for the best.
So when you first put out that post on Instagram and you first did even the beginning of your shop, aside from obviously the friends who were saying, when are you going to sell? When can I buy your stuff? Where did people come from since starting in it so early days and actually being intentional about an Instagram account too, I think is encouraging for me to see someone making a go of it without being an Instagram influencer at the same time, like without having 40,000 followers to say, oh yeah, of course you could sell anything if you have enough.
One of my main focuses for making sure that I have customers is newsletter, is having a mailing list. My last shop, which was the second sale, which was me selling the seconds pieces, half of that sold out within the first 4 hours purely from my mailing list. So that is a really valuable source of custom for me. But mainly my customers are Instagram, and it's just been a consistent, steady showing up there. And I went through a period where I was quite nervous about it and worried about how often I should show up. And I've relaxed a little bit more into just authentically showing up when I've got something to say and posting when I've got something to show and showing the day to day. And you worry that people on Instagram are watching your things going, oh my gosh, she is so boring. Why is she showing me this? Like, I sit and watch somebody tidy their room for 7 minutes and I find it thrilling. So I have to remember that people are interested in the day to day. They are interested in the behind the scenes. The amount of people that have said, oh, I love seeing this part of it because it's part of the journey. It's part of you showing how you've made this or what your day-to-day looks like as a potter who is going to make a mug that I'm going to be drinking out of. It adds a story to the piece that they're eventually going to hold. So I think Instagram has been huge.
And Maggie knows she's cute, so you can always just, when in doubt.
She's just my best fallback, she is, yeah.
Exactly. Just when in doubt, we just
Maggie.
Post dog photos. That's what we do.
Yeah, little demon.
I love it. I love it. You made a super important point about a mailing list because that's also something that now you're in control of. So if Instagram gets sued by the U.S. Congress again or something, who knows? If it just becomes a dumpster fire, you have access to your customers still outside of that.
Exactly.
Feed.
I can talk directly to them. And somebody signing up and saying, yeah, you can come into my inbox, that's a huge show of confidence. Saying, yeah, I want to hear from you, solely from you, not in passing on Instagram. I want to hear from you. That's huge. So every time somebody signs up to my mailing list, I'm like, yes, I can't believe you want to hear from me. That's exciting. So yeah, the mailing list has been a really good source of income and it's been a good show of confidence as I grow my business.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's something that so many people don't think about from the very beginning. I used to talk about it a lot, and maybe I should start talking about it again in terms of you don't own Instagram, you don't control it. And so if that's where all of your revenue is coming from, that would be like, this is a really lame metaphor, but that would be like for me as a photographer, expecting someone else to bring the camera to the gig.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And just hoping that they show up.
Yeah,
like,
they just show up with a Kodak film.
Yeah, here's my iPhone.
Yeah, I think not putting all your eggs in one basket is important. And that's something that I'm still wrestling with and learning and hoping that will change as I grow, is that I can rely slightly less on Instagram to get the word out and rely slightly less on Instagram as my shop window. That the aim eventually is to be able to have Instagram there as your first point of contact, perhaps with me as a maker, but eventually to have enough outlets and enough shop windows in different areas that you are appealing to a wider base and talking to a much wider audience of people, and that you don't have to rely on and therefore get stressed out by Instagram as a whole, because it can be quite a stressful space to maintain.
Yes. Just yesterday, I was like, oh, I should do Reels. I should do Reels because they're promoting them, more people would see them. Why am I not doing it? I should do it. And then it's just, something's got to give. And there's not that many hours in the day to then also have a life. Because that's, I don't know if you've run into this, but that's the biggest catch-22 I find of, if I didn't have this job, I could commit full-time and do so many things, and then all of a sudden you find yourself that you've given yourself a 60 or a 70-hour-a-week job in having your own business instead of your 40-hour-a-week job that, somebody else paid you and you just left and you were done.
Yeah. When I was teaching, I found it much easier to step away. And it was really hard with the teaching to switch off. You never really switched off because you were always worried about Monday morning or about the next lesson. But I certainly felt like I'd earned my time off. And when I took that 6 weeks summer holiday or a week's half-term holiday, it was earned and I spent it relaxing. Now I go 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 days and realise I haven't taken a day off. And then when I have got a day off, I'm thinking, maybe I should be back in the street. It's only at the bottom of the garden. I could just pop down just for a moment, just dabble, and then I've done 3 hours on my day off. So I have to be quite intentional now about taking that time and literally being in my pajamas all day and just laying on the floor with the dogs and cuddling and doing nothing, because it is hard. It is hard to take time off, to switch off from a job when it's at the bottom of the garden and when it's your choice to do it. You feel like any time that you're not putting towards it is wasted, because it's your choice and you've got a lot to prove in making sure that it works.
Nobody can see me. I'm sitting over here like nodding my head like, yep, yep. And I still feel this way 1,000%. And I also for me, there's an added layer of it is a massive privilege to be self-employed. I was only able to start my business in my studio 10 years ago, similar to you in the fact that like I had massive support from my parents. I lived with a roommate. I did all of these things that like, yes, you're still working your butt off, but there's so much privilege around having the opportunity and the chance to even do it in the first place that then I feel like if I'm not using my time fully, what a jerk, I think about like my grandpa was a farmer. He worked when the sun came up until the sun went down. And so that's what you do. And it's maybe that wasn't completely healthy.
100% feel that way too. But I also, was saying to myself the other day, when I was teaching, it was hard work. It could be quite stressful. It was a struggle. And because of that, I didn't fully enjoy it. And I did question, why does a job have to be a struggle? And why do you feel bad if it isn't a struggle? Why can't you have a job that you take time off from and you enjoy your job? And this is separate from being self-employed and that being a privilege and having the privilege of familial support and having the privilege of parents who blindly loyal and just trust that I will make it happen. That's a privilege in itself to have such unwavering support. But in terms of taking time off, I really do have to be careful with myself and say, no, take the time off. It doesn't have to be a struggle. You don't have to be running yourself into the ground. The amount of times I've seen recently written down that we shouldn't glorify burnout. We do because we feel guilty about not working, but I did burn out towards Christmas. I thought, no, I really need to take the time off. And I came off Instagram for a little while. When I showed back up, nothing bad had happened. And I took that as my cue to be like, okay, yeah, you can take the time off. You can stop posting. You can stop pouring your all into it 24/7. It'll be okay. And so I don't think it has to consistently be a struggle, but it's really hard to get out that mindset.
And for creatives, the fact that it's actually crucial. And this is the hardest thing for me is that you're not going to come up with anything new or interesting or unique to yourself if you're just grinding at it. Like you need that hike or that walk or that day in the pajamas to just let the ideas sit. And maybe it's about being intentional with our time off. Maybe it's going on a walk instead of sitting and binge watching whatever.
Yeah. Part of the reason that I wanted to be self-employed was so that I was in charge of my time. Mm-hmm. And then I'm terrible in charge of it, not using it properly. But, that's one of the beauties, isn't it, of being self-employed, is you can sit down for a cup of tea when you feel you need one, or you can go for a walk. So definitely being more intentional about taking that time is important.
I have no solutions or suggestions 10 years later of what makes it easier to say it's okay and that it's fine and that it's healthy and yes, it's a luxury, but that it's also a healthy thing. That I think that's going to be an ongoing struggle for all of us.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
I don't know. And this is where I don't have that segue. I don't want to end on that really melancholy note either.
I suppose like maybe one of the things, and you can cut this bit out, this is just me musing now, but I know as a beginner, I feel like a beginner. And I remember when I messaged you and you were like, so tell me about your photography setup. And I was like, oh, it's really beginner because that is how I view myself. And you were like, no, that's not beginner. No, you're using a real camera.
Right.
You're using Lightroom.
The fact that you actually even knew like a manual setup to like, you didn't turn it on a little green button. So you're about 3 steps ahead of most people.
I know that if I'm feeling like a beginner, then there's a lot of lack of confidence surrounding being a beginner and comparing your beginner to somebody else's beginner. And I think probably one of the main points as somebody who is starting out to get across is that if you are just side hustling for 3 hours a month, if that's all you can manage in a community studio, or just getting bits and bobs done from the garden shed, to not compare your beginning to somebody else's, or not compare your skills as they are at the moment to somebody who is in a completely different situation. That's why I felt it was important to mention how I'm able to do what I'm doing, because I know that when I've looked at other people doing my job but with a completely different set of circumstances, I'm prone to compare myself and go, why am I not doing as well?
Right.
I think it's just to be kind to yourself about where you are at in that process.
Yeah.
Because it can be really easy with Instagram to kind of to compare yourself.
Well, and this is part of why I don't want to say badgered, but it might have been badgered you to have this conversation, was because that's exactly why I started this, because there's so much out there around. It seems everyone at some point is becoming a ceramicist and starting a business and selling out their shop on Instagram. And as somebody who was tiptoeing into this world from one creative world to the other, I had that business experience on the back end going, but how does this work? How is this actually happening for so many people? Because there's just, even tactically speaking, like for me to start a photography business was way cheaper than to start a ceramics business.
Oh my gosh, yeah, so expensive.
It's not like I'm developing film.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really handy to hear, and for you to be doing this podcast, to hear from other creatives and how they are doing it, because my eyes have been opened, me thinking that I've got all this support and everyone else has struggled to get to the point that they've got, and I've just had it handed to me. And part of me is having to tell myself, no, I've worked hard and I do have this support, but other people have different situations. But I think with what you're doing, particularly with the basics of photography and introducing people to a different way to market their work and brand their work, is really useful, because it is difficult to know where to start, particularly when you're faced with an Instagram wall of people who are already doing it. Mm-hmm. And there's no clue as to how they got to that point,
right,
at all. And it can be quite intimidating.
Or if they're just throwing, spaghetti at the wall and realize something stuck, and then I've seen this happen before, where somebody gets asked, a potter or somebody else, another maker gets asked, oh, how do you photograph your stuff? And I don't think anybody else can tell, but I can tell. They have their own system, but they don't know why. They don't know why it works or how it works, or if they were to start using a way glossier glaze and it had glare, how to fix that. And, you know.
And that has been what my 2 year build-up was about, is I really wanted to understand the whys behind what I was doing. I felt scared about winging it and then not being able to recreate. So taking time to understand why things work the way they do, and how to actually brand my work and how to build a website. I sat on my website, by the way, for a year. I was paying for it for a whole year and I didn't show anyone, because I was teaching myself how to code, and
oh god,
and it went through so many different iterations. At one point it was green and pink, like you've seen my branding now, and it's not green and pink.
Very much not. Like I can't even think of a shade of green and pink I can think of a shade of green maybe that could possibly have worked for you.
So that was my early days of spaghetti flinging at the wall and hoping it would look great, and so taking that time, I think, and having some step-by-step processes to follow is quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. For anybody who is just getting started and they're trying to figure this out, right? They're in the position that you were in on Instagram 5 years ago, where they're just watching. They're just watching everybody and they don't know. Is there anything that you wish you would have been able to know that you couldn't see in that watching, that you feel would have changed? Maybe not changed, but just anything that you wish you would have known, or if you could have a megaphone to people to tell them.
I feel like probably the main thing that I would love to be able to tell people en masse who are maybe where I was 5 years ago, watching everybody else longingly, they want to do it, but I'm not ready yet, is the person that you listen to first and foremost about whether you are ready is yourself. So don't let other people say, come on, you might as well sell this, or come on, post this, or why aren't you selling? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And this is very specifically to people who are intent on building, a business and a brand, not so much kind of hobby potters who are more happy just selling as and when and quite comfortable. I'm talking about actual brand building and pulling together something cohesive. Listen to yourself in terms of when you're ready. I did, but I had just a little bit of pushback from different areas along the way that made me doubt whether I was actually just dragging my feet and whether I was actually just lazy and just not working hard enough to make it happen. And you are, and this particularly applies to people who are doing this around a full-time job, is don't set unrealistic standards for yourself in terms of when you should be ready. There's so many shoulds with starting a business and making pottery or taking photographs of what you should do and where you should be at a certain point and when you should start releasing work. And I think it can put a lot of unrealistic pressure. So, I think my main advice would be to listen to your own kind of time frame in terms of when you feel comfortable putting things out there, because that reads in your work. I think when you're comfortable and you're confident in what you're putting out, it reads in the way you talk about it, it reads in the way that you present it to other people. Yeah. And you are much more likely to have people loving your work as much as you do if you love it and if you're confident in it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it makes everything so much, I don't want to say easier because it's still hard.
But nicer, more enjoyable, I think.
Well, and the fear of sales, or, I know we all use the word sales as a dirty word, but if you're confident in it and you love it and you're proud of it, then charging twice as much as you thought you were going to makes it a little easier because you don't want to give it up.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'd hoard all my ceramics if I didn't have a business to build.
And Maggie treats to buy.
Yes, yeah,
she would be very upset.
She's quite demanding. Total diva.
Sophia, thank you so much for your time. Where should everybody check out all of this work we've been talking about this entire time?
My ceramics is Sophia McEvoy Ceramics is my handle, and I have a website which is www.sophiamcavoy.com. So that's where you can find me at the moment. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I'm glad I talked you into it. What you all didn't hear on this episode is that I originally started following Sophia on Instagram because I was so impressed by her photography. I thought surely she had a bit of a background with cameras prior to ceramics. As she herself put it, she learned from a lot of Googling. And while the end result is still obviously wonderful, I'm going to assume that most of you wish you could skip the hours and hours and hours of Googling trying to find those actually helpful YouTube tutorials. And that is exactly why I created my at-home photography cheat sheet. This free PDF gives you the foundation for easily taking great, consistent photos at home, even if you're only using your cell phone. Download it for free at makers-playbook.com. There's a button in the top right-hand corner that says Get Free Photo Tips. Or you can just click the link in the show notes right here after you've wiped all the mud off your hands. If you enjoyed this episode of The Maker's Playbook, I would love it if you took a screenshot and shared it on Instagram. Be sure to tag me at The Maker's Playbook and Sophia at Sophia McEvoy Ceramics so we can say thank you. And until next time, go get back to making your dreams a reality, because together, we've got this.